Okay, here we go. What I think is the most important chapter in the book, and as well, it will soon make clear in the reading. In some ways, he thinks it is too. Fascinating, corrupted shaman Kakumee, who represents so much, so well of what civilization does to the healthy nature, evolution-based living, whatever you want to call it, of native peoples, people connected with a long history of evolved culture and evolution truly in the world is evolution in its true sense. I'm also noticing for the first time that it just happens to be chapter 13, famous unlucky number. I wonder if Mowat did that on purpose. He would be about 100 at this point if he's still alive, so I probably can't ask him. Maybe he said. Anyway, just got done making some tasty hummus for later when I finally eat with lentils instead of chickpeas, and uh, still it's a little bit of a risk because I'm still not certain if I'm going to be able to download these live streams and effectively make them into background enabled green screen ish done videos, but give it a shot. Okay. Chapter 13, Kakumee. Partly because the story of his life outlines in minuscule detail the tale of his people, and partly for other reasons, I have given Kakumee, the old shaman of the barrens, a greater place in this book than I give to any other man. His story is one of disintegration and of degeneration, and this is also the tale of his people. In life, his life is bitter and tragic, more so because it is not his alone, but also the tragedy of his race. It was a long time before I came to know much of his story, for the name of Kakumee is anathema in the mouths of the Helmuet. When they can be brought to speak of him, they speak shortly and with the bridle of fear on their tongues. Even Utek, who was my song cousin, spoke of Kakumee only when I begged him to speak, and he grew visibly uneasy whenever I mentioned the name of the old shaman. Ohoto, too, that brash man who claimed to fear nothing, would not tell me much of Kakumee, but would deftly switch the subject and talk instead of the deer or of the land. Franz has known him well, yet even in the stories Franz told, I detected an undercurrent of tension and of uneasiness. Eventually, it dawned upon me that Franz, who believed he was gifted as white men are with superiority over the primitive natives, Franz, too, was afraid of Kakumee. Because I could at first gather only vague clues to the reasons which led the Helmut to fear the old man, my curiosity grew. In the early summer of 1948, I even began to prepare for a journey northward to the shores of Kakumee Kamanik, where the two tents of the shaman stood apart from the rest of the people. The preparations were needless, for this man who had brought a great fear into the land had heard much of Andy and me from some of the other Yahamwood, and had developed plans to bring us into his orbit of influence. One summer day, I looked casually from the window of Windy Cabin and saw a stranger approaching. He came up and stood by the door, not offering to enter unbidden, as the other Eskimos always did. So I went out to meet him. He was not a tall man, yet he was even more massively built than old Hikwa. His great legs were bowed slightly apart, supporting a square body almost as broad as it was high. But it was the face that held my attention. I shall never forget the face of Kakumee. When I think of him, I remember those magnificent yet hideous masks of the Iroquois used to portray the faces of their devils. Kakumee's face was like a masterful devil mask that had weathered and cracked through the centuries under the storms and the sun. It was ancient, not in terms of mere years, but ancient in time, long since forgotten by men. Two or three clumps of straggling hairs clung from his pointed goat chin, in the shadow of a bulbous lower lip. That great lip splayed downward to expose a broken, outpointing row of dark-colored teeth, each as massive as the tooth from the jaw of a fossil. A sparse fringe of hairlets was permanently cemented to his upper lip by an unchecked dribble of mucus. His eyes were tiny black marbles sunk deeply under the thrust of his brow and folded under taut curtains of skin. Yet they glistened out from their crevices as the black eyes of great spiders shine from their shadowed caves under the rocks. His forehead was itself a great rock, cut by 10,000 crevices left by the weather. Above his face was a wild mane of rough, graying hair knotted and twisted in confusion. That was our first meeting, but many more followed as Kakumee sought by all cunning he knew to turn Andy and me against the rest of the people. He was the first Eskimo I had met who deliberately lied. And for a while I almost believed the slanderous stories he told us about Utek and the others, for I was not prepared to find an Ihalmeo who did not speak the truth. Kakumee did more than try to alienate us from the others with lies. He threatened them directly and us indirectly, and it was only because we refused to be initiated and intimidated, and so set ourselves up against him, that the other men dared to remain our friends. Kakumee wheedled me, bribed me, lied to me, threatened me, and revolted me. Yet despite it all, I grew fascinated by the character of the man and increasingly covetous of the incredible store of knowledge he possessed, of days lost to all memory but his. He was a master of indirection, and his subtlety was often too much for mine, but after a while I began to understand him a little. In time, too, I managed to get at some of the stories about him which were known to the rest of the people. Kakumee was born on the River of Men, not far above the little lakes where the people now live. His father was Ajut, a shaman whose fame had spread beyond the limits of the plains and who was known even to the distant folk dwelling by the sea. In these days of his childhood, Kakumee was one of more than 1,000 Ihalmwood who lived along the banks of the river and on the lakes thereabout. Ajut's 3 wives had given him other sons, and of these the eldest was Kakut, who lived to be a great man and the enemy of Kakumee. When Kakumee was born, about 1880, no white man had yet entered the land of the people, but in the spring of 1894, 2 canoes came down the river from the south, bringing the first white stranger into the land. This man was Tyrell, and though Kakumee was but a youth at the time, he can still recall every detail of that visit. This time reading the book, it occurs to me to calculate Kakumee's age at that time, 14. I think it's significant that that's the dawn of puberty, the dawn of adulthood, the dawn of potential rebelliousness against elders that you don't fully respect. Tyrell stayed only a day at the camp because he was anxious about the future, and he did not know where the river would lead him. As a good host, Ajut undertook to accompany Tyrell downriver and show him the way out of the Ihalmwood country. When the canoes moved off, they were accompanied by kayaks of Ajut and of his eldest son, Kakut. When Ajut and Kakut returned to their home, nearly a month later, they brought extravagant tales of what they had seen of the fabulous things the white man carried in his canoes. Kakumee listened avidly to those tales of the wealth of the stranger, and he harbored them in his mind. All of the Ihalmwood spoke of these things with much wonder, but though they saw and appreciated the worth of Tyrell's belongings, they did not envy the white man. The people were not greedy for change, and so remained content with the life they had always known by the River of Men. In a few years, the little gifts Tyrell had made to them were lost or broken, and the memory of the white man's wealth grew dim. It was this way with all of the Ihalmwood, save one alone. Kakumee did not forget. He remembered the goods of the white man as if they had been, in fact, the goods of Kakumee. He dreamed vivid dreams, and these remained in the daytime to haunt him. He was filled with a great longing he could not describe, for there were no words in the language of the Helmut to describe the insatiable yearning that had come over him to possess material things. But he kept his dreams to himself, for he knew they were evil according to the laws of life in the land. So he spoke no word of the visions which were hidden deep in his mind. Again, I'm thinking of the continuum concept and the little I've learned about how the minds of young children are formed. And it's when the question of nature versus nurture comes up, it's been resolved that it's never one or the other. It's never black and white. It's a balance. So surely there's some genetic or perhaps spiritual, maybe related to genetic component to Kakumee. But if there was something about his upbringing that was very different, about his young childhood, some incident, some tragedy that caused this darkness in his soul, this greed, so narcissistic, like Donald Trump, like I said earlier, and to separate him from the wonderful, generous, grateful love and warmth of spirit that all the other people have. In the winter of the year when Tyrell passed down the river, Ajut decided his two eldest sons had crossed the threshold from childhood to manhood. During that winter, both Kekut and Kakumee began to receive instruction in the shaman's secrets known to their father, for long ago it had been decided that these two sons of the shaman would follow in the path of old Ajut. It's interesting that the blindness of parents is part of it, but again, I want to know more about young Kakumee and if anyone saw warning signs and ignored them, or perhaps just could not comprehend the warning signs. Ajut revealed to his sons all that he himself knew of the spirits of the land, and taught them the magic spells which are spoken in an ancient language. He explained the manner of calling on Kaila, the wind of the sky, and the great god of all men. He warned the youths of the dangers of Paija, Apopa, and the other inimical spirits, and explained how they could master these beings. Before the coming of spring, there came a time when Ajut could teach his sons nothing more. Now it was left to them to find their own way. It is the custom for a youth who wishes to become a shaman to seek out seclusion far from all other men, and there know such suffering that he may meet a Tornrak. Tornrak is in italics. A good spirit who will speak to the novice as he lies or sits in a trance. This Tornrak then becomes the guiding spirit of the new shaman, and is the strongest and most potent force the shaman can call on for aid in the future. Kekut, being the eldest, was the first to set out alone from the camps. He was gone nearly 2 weeks, and he carried no food for his trip, nor did he eat during that time. It was a period of great storms, and though he had no shelter from the driving winds, Kekut survived to return to the camp of his father and to tell of what he had found. 5 days out from the camp, he had been halted by a blizzard and had squatted in the lee of a rock which thrust out from the snow. Here he stayed for a week or more. He could not tell how long it was, and he did not move, nor did he eat. About the 5th day, he thought he had died, yet in death he beheld a huge crooked stick pushed out of the snow at his feet. He listened with terror while the stick spoke strange words. Then it grew arms, long and knotty arms, and from its lower end thrust out a spidery tangle of legs. Kekut was filled with fear, but at the same time he drew out his snow knife and made a lunge at the thing. Thing is capitalized. His knife was twitched from his hand, and so he flung himself on the being and grappled with its twisted body of wood until at long last he subdued it. Then he rose to his feet and said, first I'll pause. I'm almost at 15 minutes. Ketorak, you, the spirit of the forests, now you are mine. You shall do my word in all things and never again go free in the forests, far to the south of this land. Kakut broke a twig from the back of the spirit and sewed it into his amulet belt, and then he came back to the camp. Thus it was that Kakut found his torn rack. This whole paragraph is in italics now. It was Kakumee's turn then, and this is the tale that he tells of his search for the torn rack. And then there is one of those very rare 3 asterisk breaks, major breaks within a chapter. I find myself wondering, since this is all in the voice of Kakumee, what kind of voice I might speak in. I find myself wanting to almost speak like Christian Bale famously spoke in as the Dark Knight in Batman trilogy. But also in thinking of Kakut's wrestling with the twig and its representation of the forest spirit, which we later learn the forests are not an object of awe and worship to the plains people, but an object of terror. I find myself thinking about the night, one of the most special chocolate highs that I ever had when I wandered along the long path in the 250 acres of the campus woods at the University of New Hampshire in Durham, New Hampshire, in the dark, and in some indirect ways, I was overcome with the breakup with Jen that I'd had, and a bout of strength and clarity and a desire to fight. And I remember wandering along that path in the complete darkness. There was no moon, there were no clouds reflecting any light, and wandering through the forest with some of the greatest feeling of strength that I'd ever felt, as if I was questing after whatever it was that I was afraid of. I was speaking to the forest and to the shadows, daring in a way for whatever I was afraid of to come out and face me. Like, I think in my mind I was imagining in some ways confronting it and wrestling it as Kakut had done successfully, and possibly finding some kind of forest spirit. But then I remember at the end of the walk feeling as if I was being arrogant and presumptuous in some way, not having nearly the kind of connection with nature and the learning, the spiritual nature, and the connection with the genuine gods of a place to be able to be so demanding of whatever forest spirits might have been there, if there were any. And yeah, nothing happened. In some ways it felt like a relief, because I had dared what I was frightened of to come face me, and it didn't, almost as if I had scared it away. But on the other hand, I was almost slightly let down because no forest spirit had come to be my guide. Some vague attempt to be a shaman, perhaps. I went forth from the camp in the morning before it was light, and I walked into the north. It was cold, but I felt nothing of that. I was hungry, yet I felt nothing of hunger. I was alone after a time in a place where not even a fox track crossed the snow. I came to a frozen lake, and in the middle of it I built a half shelter of snow and sat down to wait. Nothing came for many days but the wind. Then on a night there was a great crashing noise from deep under the ice. I thought at once of the great fish which is said to live in the lakes, and I got up to run to the shore, but my legs were so stiff and cramped they refused to obey me. So I fell on the ice and lay as one who is dead. The ice under me crashed and muttered and splintered until the cold water surged up through the cracks and filled my mouth and my nostrils. Still I could not move from that spot, and at last the ice under me sank into the water and carried me down. All was dark in my eyes, and then slowly a thing began to take shape in the green mist of the water. It was no fish, but the head of a man with no body and with arms and legs springing right out of its head. But the strangest of all things was that this was the head of a white man. though not the one I had seen on the river of the previous summer. It was a strange face, heavily bearded, and with cold eyes the color of sky. I knew I was drowning, and I struggled against the grip of the water, and all the time that great head swam about me and laughed, making a horrible bubbling sound in my ears. I knew it was a tornrak and that I should grapple with it and conquer it so that it would help me in the future, but the cold water was filling my lungs and I was drowning. I do not know how long I struggled under the ice, but I believed I was dying, for all things faded from my mind. When I recovered myself, I was lying on top of the ice by a great black hole filled with water, but did not wish to freeze. But my water-soaked garments had frozen hard to the ice beneath me. I was bitterly cold. I fought my way out of the clothing, and it was hard as new iron. I tore my flesh from my hands and my body, wriggling out of the ice-hard furs. But at last I was free and ran naked over the lake, and the frost did not touch me. Later the people told me they followed my tracks for a full day's journey over the plains, and my bare footprints were clear in the snow. They came to the lake and saw a great hole, and my frozen clothes that looked like a dead man lying out there on the ice. But they did not go close, for no one could say how that hole had been opened through 10 feet of hard ice. When Kakumee told this story to Ajut, his father, the old man, was greatly afraid. He could not understand what it meant. He knew only that Kakumee had failed to subdue the spirit he had seen, and he may have feared that instead the spirit had captured Kakumee. But he could not be sure, and so he said nothing at all to the youth, and he told the people he believed Kakumee had captured a wonderful tornrak. In the blinding love of parents, it's like the stories from the earlier chapter when the law of life and the people don't have the strength to obey it, and they succumb to the desire to not die in the appropriate order, or let the babies die, or be cannibals if they have to in order to survive. So many stories of blinding love of parents. Parents can't see how their child isn't perfect. But that tornrak in the water, the white man, so much about that. It's just symbolism is just perfect. Drowning in the water like that, not fighting on his own turf, just like the natives against civilization, forced to fight on turf that they do not understand, drowning, and the white man representing the greed and corruption of civilization, the laughing and the bubbling, and how he saw it in the winter after seeing Tyrell, and how he understood greed at that point, and how the spirit was if it is the spirit of the land, or was it somehow traveled through the water, maybe the rainwater somehow, and reached the land, the greed of civilization, the evil of it, to capture Kakumee's spirit. In the summer of that year, Ajut died and was buried under rocks in the land where the frost does not leave the ground. He took with him his bow, his stone pipes, and his shaman's staff, but his magic he left to his sons. Kakut was satisfied with his inheritance, and after a little while he began to fill the place of his father. To him came those who suffered ills of the mind or of the body. Some he healed, and some died. But Kakut's reputation grew steadily all through the land, and he was known as a good man and as a great worker of magic. It was otherwise with Kakumee. The restless and nameless desire of his childhood had become an irresistible curse since his novitiate on the ice of the lake. His strange dreams grew more vivid and so oppressive that even the familiar spirits at his command could give him no succors. Often he had thought of calling on the bodiless head of the white man who lived under the river, under the lake, but he was afraid, for he did not know if he could control it, and he feared that it might seize him and carry him back under the waters to die. Kakumee's hunting did not prosper, nor did anything he attempted to do. He lost patience with his fine muskox horn bow one day when he was hunting, for he had tried to make it kill a deer at 300 paces, an impossible range, and so he flew into a rage at it and smashed it on a rock. He did not know why he did this. He did not know that he was remembering the rifle of the white visitor, which could kill at 300 paces. He was content with nothing made by the people, with none of the tools or weapons, and he showed his discontent more and more as the years slipped away. Had he not been a shaman, he would have been held up to ridicule, for it is often the excuse of a poor hunter that his weapons are inadequate to the task. Like the saying we have, poor craftsman blames his tools. It's a real leap and tangent here, but I often think of playing video games as a child, that fantasy realm, and blaming the controller when you fall into a hole as Mario. Thing that became a joke that we said, but I jumped. Maybe Kakumee thought he or hoped he jumped in order to avoid that hole in the water, in the deep ice. But the fear of the man was growing steadily in the hearts of the people. This was the way of things until the 5th winter after the death of Ajut. Then came a time when Kakumee took a bride, and this was strange, for he was now 22 and long past the age when most Ihalmeo men seek out a woman. He had been too obsessed by his dreams to want women. Now he took a young girl to wife, and if reports speak truly, he loved her and found in her some measure of release from the frustration which tormented his hours. He loved her, and so one, as they lay naked on the sleeping ledge of the igloo, he told her the truth about his fight with the white devil he had met under the lake. She was young, not much more than a child, and she listened without comprehension to the tale and to the illusions of great wealth that Kakumee disclosed to her in his effort to rid himself of the weight of his dreams. She listened, but could not understand. And one day she turned on her husband when others were near and openly ridiculed him in their hearing. "You are a dreamer of dreams," she cried, "but I am heavy with child, and I cannot suckle a child on the dream stuffs that fills your head and your heart. Give me something to fill these soft breasts of mine, that I may know I married a man and a hunter." I wonder what would have happened to Kakumee after that if he had a woman of more than just the usual empathy of the people, but would have had been a truly transcendent empathy, I suppose. Now take another break. Almost at 15 minutes again. Who knows what happened then in the mind of Kakumee? I think the love for his wife died, as a hair dies when an arrow splits it from end to end. But before dawn came again to that winter encampment, Kakumee had vanished out of the land. By morning, the ceaseless swirl of the drifts had filled up the tracks of his dog sled so that no one even knew which way he had gone. He had told no one of his plans, for not even his wife would have believed he was mad enough to set out alone to seek the place where the white men dwell beyond the frozen wastes of the plains. The place of the white man, of the traders, was known to the Hamlet men as at the turn of the century. It was as distant and unreal a place as the bland surface of the white moon. The people knew of the white men only through Tyrell's visit and through the magnified and distorted tales of a man called Anguilla, who had once passed through their land and who lived on the coast and knew something of the white man by hearsay. He spoke of the place called Igloo Ujarik, which is the stone house, where the white traders lived. Igloo Ujarik is Churchill, and it takes its Eskimo name from the sullen piles of gray rock which are all that remain of the fort built by Samuel Hearne in the days of the Arctic wars with the French. And Igloo Ujarik was the goal of Kakumee as he drove his long sled to the south, though he had no notion of how far it was. It was an epic journey. 3 days of hard traveling took him out of the lands of the Hamwood into the forests. These lands are forbidden to men of the people because they are the homes of the hostile Indians who have held a blood feud with the inland Eskimos since time beyond knowing, and because the country of forests is filled with demons and spirits who side with these Indians. Nevertheless, Kakumee left the hard-packed snows of the plains and entered the forests, and now his long, narrow-runnered sled, so well suited to the ice-like snows of the barrens, became an encumbrance to him. In the soft drifts, under the black roof of the spruces, the sled sank to its crossbars, and the dogs could not pull it until he had gone on ahead and broken a trail. Snowshoes were unknown to Kakumee, for there was no need of them now in the hard snows of the plains, but in the forest a man breaking trail for his dogs must wear snowshoes. Now here is a measure of the tenacity and intelligence of Kakumee. It usually takes a race of primitive people many long generations to evolve a perfect and perfect a new piece of equipment. Yet Kakumee not only solved the problem of snowshoes, but in a single day he constructed a pair that, while they were rough, were adequate to his purpose. They served these hoop-like things he had made, and so the heavy sled with its load of deer meat, and for the dogs the man drove on deeper into the forests. The forests are believed to be evil, and it is thought by some of the Hamwood men that the trees themselves live and resent the presence of Eskimo men. If an Inuit must travel and sleep in the forests, he has a grace of 5 days during which he is safe. But should he linger longer under the shadow of trees, the trees will conspire to destroy the intruder. Kakumee had now been in the forests for almost 5 days, and only the compulsion which drove him enabled him to bear the mounting terror the forest brought to his heart. On the afternoon of the 5th day, he came to a great lake with many rocky islets, which were free of trees, and on one of these islets Kakumee made a camp for the night. There was no wood for a fire, so he sat in the shelter of a low wall of snow blocks. He shivered with fear and with cold, and in desperation began to possess him. At last he sprang to his feet and cried wildly for the spear he had met in the waters under this distant lake on the barrens. For Kakumee was lost in space and terror. His supply of deer meat was nearly exhausted, and he was afraid to go on, but he could not turn back. He feared many things, but most of all, he feared the Indian devil called Wendigo, who eats the flesh of travelers. The ghosts and demons of the land had voices that came through the darkness out of the forest surrounding the lake. The 5 days were done, and to Kakumee it seemed as if the black spruces had begun to grow more closely together, obstructing his terrified path. He thought that in the course of another day they would have grown so close he could not pass between them, and they would not let him withdraw, so that he would be held like a beast in a deadfall until Wendigo claimed him. Almost a decade ago, when I was part of a writing group on LinkedIn, there was a monthly short story contest in the group, and 1 month the project among the group was to write a story about a Wendigo, and I reread this passage and wrote a story about Kakumee, more directly with the Wendigo. Again, it might be Wendigo, I'm not sure, but what I would find if I were to go back and read that story. It's somewhere on my computer. He did not know how far or in what direction lay Igloo Jarek, and he did not know when he might come unexpectedly upon a camp of the Indians, who would probably murder him. All these things passed through his mind as he stood shivering by his sled and screamed a summons into the darkness to the spirit he had once seen under the water. There was no answer, but the aurora flickered with sudden violence, bathing the desolate land in a violet light, and Kakumee took this as a sign. He had no fire that night, and yet he was able to sleep alongside his sled, only the dogs curled up against his back for warmth and protection. A lesser man, or perhaps a saner man, would have turned back. Only a brave man or a madman, inexorably driven, would have continued it in the unknown, which stretched darkly ahead. Before dawn on the sixth day in the forests, Kakumee hitched up his dogs and drove southward again. Though he could not know it, he was now 200 miles off his track. Igloo Ujark lay far to the east, and to reach it he should long since have swung eastward and along one of the mighty rivers which run to the sea. But his track had been too far inland, so he had missed these waters, and now he came instead to a great frozen river that ran to the south into the forests. He could only travel where the rivers ran, for the forests were too thick to admit his long, awkward sled, even had he dared the ominous darkness under the trees. On the afternoon of the 10th day, he rounded a bend in the river and came unexpectedly on the log shanty of a white man. It was no more than 10 feet square, yet to Kakumee it seemed immense and pregnant with menace. The place was silent, and the snow about it unbroken. No smoke came from the tin pail which served as a chimney. Only the thunderous roll of the frost-riven ice splitting on top of the river could be heard. Kakumee halted his starving dogs and fingered his amulet belt as he looked fearfully at the cabin. At last he walked stiffly forward on foot and came up to the door and found it swinging ajar. Snow had banked thickly into the windowless shanty, but on one side of it a high wooden bunk was above the reach of the snow. Kakumee saw that something rested silently there. His heart was a tremulous thing in his chest, but his courage had not yet come to its end. He walked into the cabin, staring with wide, frightened eyes, and beheld a horrendous sight. He looked down upon the bearded, frozen face of a white man, and into ice-cold eyes like the blue of the sky. To Kakumee's overwrought mind, this face seemed to be one with the face he had seen during his novitiate. He could not believe that the thing he was looking at was a mere corpse. He saw it instead as the spirit he had called upon by the shores of the lake. Though he was horribly frightened, he nevertheless saw in this macabre encounter a second chance to grapple with the Tornrak who had once eluded him. Words came to his lips, garbled, gibbering words. He leapt forward and seized the head by its stiff, frozen hair. Now he grappled with the spirit, seeking to master it. The room roared with sound. Dimly Kakumee heard his own voice, screaming questions at the thing he fought with. As it lifted and wavered in front of his staring eyes, the thunder of nameless noises seemed to take on palpable form until the room became darker than darkness and suddenly vanished from the Eskimo's sight. The height of the white man grew larger until it was as large as the world, and suddenly its frozen lips parted, and the cataclysmic sound split and shattered into words. Kakumee heard, without hearing through ears, the words of his Tornrak, and they told him that he must travel on into the south, into the forests. They told him no more, and there was nothing else of that day in the memory of Kakumee. He knows only that he found himself lying on his sled while the dogs labored along the rough ice of the river. He was never to know the truth that the Tornrak he saw was no more than the corpse of a young white trapper, a man still remembered at the trading post, who was the first to enter this region, and who had died of disease during the winter. Kakumee has little memory of the rest of the journey. Only dim flashes remain until the day when his sled swung out on the bay of a huge lake. Across the bay, in the distance, many dogs broke into voice, and Kakumee saw the smoke of wood fires and the outlines of many buildings and tents. His journey was done. Before him lay what was then the most northerly interior outpost of white men in that part of the Arctic. Already this strange sled had been seen, and men ran down the high bank of the shore to receive him. Of those who witnessed the arrival of Kakumee, an Indian and 2 white men are still alive. One of the whites is a priest, and the other a trader, long since retired, who lives now only in the days that are dead. But the Indian and both these white men remember Kakumee. The white men speak with awe of his journey, for he had come through the heart of Indian country where he would probably have been shot at once had he been seen. The priest and the trader each had his motives for making much of the stranger who had arrived from the unknown lands to the north. The priest looked upon Kakumee as a contact with men who had not yet heard the call of the Lord. The trader quickly grasped the fact that in the desolate depth of the tundra there lived a hitherto unknown race of Eskimo hunters whose land was filled with the fabulously valuable white Arctic fox. Both of these men wanted Kakumee to make a safe return to his people and persuade them to visit the post, or at least they wanted him to act as a liaison agent between the post and the barons. The trader had once lived on the coast and knew a smattering of the Inuit tongue. Now he took great pains to learn the strange dialect of Kakumee. Also, he feted the Eskimo, taking him into his own cabin. He gave Kakumee many valuable presents, and so at last the nebulous dreams which for so long had tormented the Eskimo were brought to fruition. Oh, what an experience, such a cancerous greed in someone's heart, rewarded like that. And in truth, like Donald Trump getting to be president, proving to not be reward enough. When greed and an empty soul truly take hold of you, it's a black hole, and no matter what you pour into it, it's just never enough. The trader allowed Kakumee to wander at will through the store and the storehouse, where he displayed a never-ending succession of marvelous things before the gleaming eyes of the man from the north. I'll break again, close to 15 minutes again. The priest also worked on Kakumee. Though he could not speak the tongue of the Inuit, he too made small gifts of small images, which the Eskimo took to be amulets of great power, and tied to the sorcerer's belt at his shoulder. It's a powerful image. Some of the supposedly powerful, holy and goodly things, symbols of Christianity, tied to the belt of a completely corrupt shaman of a native people. Now the winter was drawing to its close, and there was a long road ahead of Kakumee. Both the priest and the trader were anxious to see him start north. Kakumee was called into the storeroom and was given a large quantity of trade goods. The things he was given made him sick with desire, yet he was told they were not his own, but were to be traded for furs with his people. It was made clear to him that when he returned with the furs on the following winter, he would receive for himself much more than lay on his sled. On the books of the trading post, the name Kakumee, Kahoom-EE, was written, and after it the words, "Engaged as native trader to the Eskimo lands." And in the mind of the priest was engraved the name of Kakumee and the thought, "This is the first of my converts among the many poor heathen children who live in the north." Both white men had worked hard with good plans to work from, but this time the plans failed, for though they had reckoned with Kakumee the man, they had not reckoned with Kakumee the devil of Kakumee the shaman. It was only 3 weeks before breakup was due when the Eskimo left the post for the north. He drove his well-fed dogs up the river, and he carried a brand new 44-40 rifle strapped to his back. The sled was so heavily laden that he could not ride on it, but had to walk ahead or behind. This small thing gives some indication of the man's depth of purpose, for it is almost axiomatic that an Eskimo will not walk when he can ride, even if it means jettisoning part of his load. Kakumee jettisoned nothing and walked. The great sled creaked heavily over the rough ridge of ice of the lakes and on the river, and the dogs spread out in their harness and stretched forward with their heads almost touching the snow underfoot. Progress was desperately slow, but Kakumee cared nothing for that. He was not afraid any more not even of the ghosts of the forest, for he did not carry the amulets. For did he not carry the amulets of the bearded white man? He was not afraid of the Indians, for did he not carry a fine rifle strapped to his back? He sang the songs of the shaman as he walked to the north, and there was a fierce exultation that sat in his heart and burned as hotly as the passion for wealth had burned in his soul. His devil, his Tornrak, was a great devil indeed, and the man was as great as his devil. No one knows for certain, for the Indians never spoke of the affair afterward, whether the 5 toboggan-like carrioles, which went north a few days after Kakumee, were driven by men with an evil purpose in their minds. Probably not, for these were good children of the white priest, and they would have heeded his warning not to injure the Eskimo. Still, it was possible that the 5 young Indians intended to take some of the wealth from this outlander who had come empty-handed into their land and was leaving it richer than even the chiefs of the XIII. I do not believe they carried murder in their hands, though they may have had it deep in their hearts, for the blood feud between the two races is more ancient than any man knows. I can only guess at their intentions, but this is what happened. Kakumee traveled upriver, and he left a clear track. He built great fires at night, and gorged on the unfamiliar foodstuffs he carried on his sled. He had no fear of the land, of its spirits, or of its people, and so he traveled with no caution at all. 10 days from the post he came to the south shores of Nuelthen we call it, which in the Indian tongue means lake of the island that sleeps like a man. Kakumee camped on the wooded foreshore and not on the barren rock of an islet. Before he lay down to sleep, he made careful beds of spruce boughs for each of his dogs, since his power to carry his fabulous wealth depended on the well-being of his beasts. Then, as the fire burned down, the man stretched out under his robes. Even in sleep he was aware of the hard, powerful presence of the rifle which lay with him under the skins. It was more wonderful than a woman, and Kakumee's contentment was as great as if he were sleeping with his wife. It was an early 80s television show, short-running show, that I remember liking, sort of a comedy about a police officer who was completely in love with his gun and slept with it. Can't remember the name, though. The fire was still smoldering when 5 dog teams came down the dark and blue-shadowed shore of the lake. Kakumee's dogs heard the approach and howled their alarm and surprise, but the man, secure in the fantastic ride of his wild dreams, did not heed the cries of his dogs. He thought they were merely howling at wolves. He awoke only when the 5 carrioles careened off the ice, up the low shore, and into the camp. 5 dark, lithe men leapt from the carrioles and came quickly up to the fire. Only one carried his rifle, for they expected no trouble from a lone man. Kakumee did not understand the guttural words they addressed to him as he sat up and stared at the strangers. He did not move, but sat like a frozen image of death, and the Indians did not understand what was in the image's eyes. One of the Indians started to unhitch his team while the others walked over to the spruce beds which the Eskimo had made for his dogs, and pushed the Inuit dogs to one side so the lean mongrels of the Indians might have the beds. For an instant, no eyes were watching Kakumee, and in that instant, he acted. The 44-40 was out, and red flame was in his mouth before it was seen by the Indians, and 3 of them were crumpled up on the snow before they even knew what had happened. The heavy lead slugs of the rifle caught them before they could move, and a man who is hit by a massive slug of such a rifle does not move again. The 2 men who were lucky ran frantically to their carrioles and were away down the lake in an instant, with the dull roar of the rifle still in their ears and the high whistle of the lead slugs splitting the frozen stillness of the lake. Kakumee, in the morning, moved on. 3 lightly loaded toboggans and dog teams followed on a lead rope behind him, but 3 men slept by the black coals of the fire on the shores of Nuelthen, the lake of the island that sleeps like a man. Thrown careless on top of their bodies were 3 or 4 little images cast in soft metal. for Kakumee had noticed that each of the dead men wore such an image about his neck, and so Kakumee plucked the amulets which the priest had given him from his belt and flung them with contempt on the bodies. The charms of the priest had not protected these men from the fury which was the gift of the Tornrak of the shaman. Christianity is no match for the dark, greedy heart of civilization. Kakumee drove on, and that day he left the forts behind and headed out onto the rolling plains. He did not care that he had killed out of fear for his wealth and not for his life.